It was a hot day in the dusty town of Mescalero, New Mexico. The sun beat down relentlessly on the cracked earth, making the air shimmer in the distance. Joe Kidd, a seasoned bounty hunter, sat calmly on the porch of the only saloon in town, his weathered hat tilted low, hiding his sharp eyes from the prying sun. He had been tracking his quarry for days, but today felt different. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. Kidd's quiet gaze followed the town's few inhabitants, all of whom hurried to finish their business and retreat to the shade of their homes. Everyone in town knew the lawmen were looking for him, but Joe Kidd wasn't one to hide. He never ran, and today was no different. He knew his enemies were closing in, the men he had been hunting for months, led by the ruthless Frank Sutherland. But Frank didn't know Joe, and today, Joe wasn't about to let Sutherland's crew run free any longer. As Kidd stood and adjusted the gun belt strapped to his waist, the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves reached his ears. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel it. The ambush was coming, and it was time to face it head on. Joe Kidd was ready. As the dust cloud kicked up from the hooves of approaching horses, Joe Kidd turned to face the street. The sheriff's deputies and Frank Sutherland's crew rode into the town, stopping right in front of the saloon. The air was thick with anticipation. The deputies, some familiar with Joe, gave him wary glances while Sutherland, the leader of the group, looked down on him from his saddle, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Joe Kidd," Sutherland called, his voice laced with mockery. "I hear you're the best bounty hunter in the West. What are you doing here? You can't hide forever." Joe Kidd's face remained stoic, his eyes narrowing beneath his hat as he assessed the situation. The showdown was inevitable. Kidd had known this day would come, and he wasn't about to back down now. Slowly, he lifted his hands, adjusting his position, subtly readying himself for the inevitable. "You've made a lot of enemies, Frank," Joe replied coolly. "But today, you made a mistake. You came to my town." Frank's smirk faded as he realized Joe wasn't intimidated. He motioned to his men, and the tension in the street grew unbearable. Joe's hand brushed over the grip of his revolver, feeling the cold steel beneath his fingers. It was a moment that stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, with a sudden movement, the first shot rang out, breaking the silence. It was a fight that would leave no room for hesitation. The first gunshot shattered the stillness of the street, the sound echoing off the walls of the empty buildings. It was a sharp, deafening crack that set off a flurry of movement. Frank Sutherland's men reached for their weapons, but Joe Kidd was already in motion. His hand shot out like lightning, and with expert precision, his revolver barked twice, taking down two of the closest men in an instant. They didn't even have time to react. As the gunfire erupted, Joe ducked behind a barrel, using it for cover as he strategically moved down the street. His heart was steady, his mind sharp. He had been in too many gunfights to let panic take over now. Every step he took was calculated, his eyes scanning for targets, his ears tuned to the sound of hooves pounding the earth. Frank Sutherland wasn't one to back down easily, and he quickly took cover behind a wooden cart. From there, he began firing, hoping to catch Joe off guard. But Joe Kidd had already anticipated this, and with a calm, collected demeanor, he leaned out from behind his cover just enough to fire back. A well-aimed shot caught one of Sutherland's men in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse. The remaining deputies began to circle, trying to pin Joe down, but his movement was fluid, his instincts razor-sharp. He moved like a shadow, never staying in one spot for too long. Each time one of the men aimed at him, Joe was already out of their line of sight, his bullets finding their marks before they could even get a proper shot off. The fight had gone from a simple confrontation to an all-out battle for survival. Dust and smoke filled the air, mingling with the screams and cries as bodies hit the ground. Joe Kidd, however, remained unshaken, his eyes focused solely on the target in front of him, Frank Sutherland. This was personal. The street was silent for a brief moment, the air thick with tension. Joe Kidd had finally cornered Frank Sutherland. He stood at the far end of the street, his revolver raised, eyeing the man who had started this entire mess. Sutherland, covered in dirt and sweat, was crouched behind an old wagon trying to catch his breath. He wasn't a fool. He knew that he was running out of options. He had lost most of his men, and Joe Kidd was one of the last gunslingers you wanted to face in a fight. Joe's hand tightened around the handle of his revolver. He didn't need to speak. His mere presence was enough to send a message. Frank slowly rose from behind his cover, his own gun trembling in his hands, a look of desperation in his eyes. The moment was almost cinematic. Two men, both with a past full of bloodshed, now facing each other in the final act. There was no more running, no more tricks, just the raw, inevitable outcome of their deadly game. Joe's voice cut through the silence. "You should have known better than to come after me, Frank." Sutherland's lips curled into a sneer, though his hands were unsteady. "You're gonna regret this, kid," he muttered, his voice strained. He was trying to muster what little bravado he had left, but deep down, he knew the truth. This was over. Without a word, Joe Kidd moved, faster than a striking viper. He lunged from behind his cover, aiming his revolver straight at Sutherland. In that split second, everything seemed to slow. Frank's finger tightened on his trigger, but it was too late. Joe's bullet struck him in the chest, sending him crashing backward against the wagon, his life extinguished in an instant. Joe Kidd stood there for a moment, watching as the dust settled around him. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, the sun dipping below the horizon as the street fell silent. Joe lowered his revolver, the weight of the battle finally lifting from his shoulders. He had won, but the price was clear in his eyes. This wasn't about glory, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And in the end, Joe Kidd had come out on top. He turned and began walking away, his boots heavy on the dirt path. Behind him, the fading light of the setting sun cast a long shadow across the quiet town, marking the end of a fight that had changed everything.